I still remember the day Lucas invited me to his house. Looking back now, it seems almost trivial, an ordinary invitation, but in that moment, it felt like the start of something that would quietly shift everything. I, Ethan, had always considered Lucas more than just a friend. We shared jokes, long nights of conversation, and the kind of trust that only develops over years. Yet, there was a subtle undercurrent in our friendship, something unspoken that neither of us fully acknowledged. That evening, it came closer to the surface than ever before. Lucas and I had met in college, both of us drawn to each other by a shared love for late-night movies and an absurd sense of humor. Over the years, our lives intertwined in ways that made separating the two of us almost impossible. He knew my fears, my regrets, and even my quiet hopes for the future. I knew the same about him. It was a friendship that had always been a safe space, a place where vulnerability didn't feel dangerous. And yet, there was a tension between us, subtle enough to dismiss as familiarity, but persistent enough that it made my chest tighten whenever we lingered too long on personal stories. When Lucas called me that afternoon, his voice carried the same easy charm I had grown accustomed to over the years. "Hey, Ethan. I know it's short notice, but my mom is hosting a small dinner at our place tonight. You should come, it wouldn't be the same without you." His tone was casual, but I could hear something beneath it, a quiet hope, a desire to share space with me. I hesitated only briefly. My rational mind reminded me that Daniel, his partner, would be away on a work trip. But curiosity, and perhaps an unacknowledged longing, won over. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'll be there." Arriving at Lucas's house was like stepping into a world that was both familiar and unexpectedly intimate. His mother, Mrs. Harper, greeted me warmly, her kindness immediately dissolving the slight tension I had carried from the drive. The house smelled faintly of lavender and fresh bread, a comforting combination that made the evening feel welcoming. Daniel's absence was mentioned lightly, as if it were expected, and Lucas busied himself in ways that made the home feel alive without any sense of urgency. I found myself relaxing, allowing the comfort of routine and familiarity to settle over me. The evening progressed with gentle laughter and light conversation, mostly surrounding mundane topics, work, hobbies, old college stories. Yet, there was an undercurrent, subtle but unmistakable. When Lucas spoke, there was a softness in his tone when he looked at me, a pause that lingered longer than necessary before shifting the topic. I caught myself noticing it, a part of me wondering if I was imagining something that perhaps didn't exist. But the feeling persisted, quietly unsettling and yet strangely magnetic. As the night grew quieter and Mrs. Harper retreated to her own room, Lucas and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The house felt different in this moment, intimate in ways that were impossible to ignore. We sank into the familiar rhythm of conversation, talking about everything and nothing, memories and minor regrets. The comfort of our shared history made the conversation flow effortlessly, but beneath it, I sensed a tension neither of us acknowledged. It was as though the walls themselves leaned closer, listening, urging us to confront the subtle emotions we had always avoided. I remember sitting there, feeling a mix of anticipation and unease. Something had shifted, though I couldn't yet name it. The ordinary visit, the casual invitation, had opened a door to emotions I had long kept buried. And even though nothing overt had happened, I felt it, the quiet pull of something unspoken, a line we were about to cross, though neither of us knew exactly how. In that stillness, I realized that the night had already begun to change everything, even if I couldn't yet understand the depth of it, and as Lucas handed me a cup of tea, smiling in a way that carried both warmth and something more, I felt a shiver of recognition. This was no longer just a friendly visit. Something unspoken had begun, something that would quietly unravel the careful boundaries we had always maintained. And in that moment, I understood, by the end of this night, nothing would be the same again. The house had grown quiet, the soft hum of the evening settling around us like a second skin. Mrs. Harper had retreated to her room, and the remaining silence made every sound, our laughter, the clinking of cups, feel amplified. Lucas and I lingered in the living room, our conversation drifting from trivial matters to topics we rarely spoke of aloud. It started casually enough, memories of college nights, favorite books, fleeting regrets. But then, inevitably, we crossed into deeper territory, our fears, our loneliness, the parts of ourselves we often hid from others. Lucas leaned back in his chair, eyes reflecting a vulnerability I had seldom seen. Sometimes, he began quietly, I feel like I'm just going through the motions. Like nothing I do really matters. Not even to Daniel, sometimes. His voice was almost a whisper, but it landed heavily on me, each word carrying weight. I felt a twinge of something I couldn't name, concern, yes, but also an unsettling warmth. My instinct was to reach out, to offer comfort, to bridge the gap between us. But the line between friendship and something more, something unspoken, hovered uncomfortably close that I tried to keep my voice calm. Lucas. I don't think that's true. You matter. You always matter. But my own words felt fragile, insufficient. He nodded, but didn't look away, and the silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. It was in that silence that I felt the shift, the subtle, quiet crossing of boundaries we had never intended to cross. Our friendship had always been safe, predictable, a place of trust. And yet now, it felt like walking on ice, beautiful, reflective, but treacherous beneath the surface. That we talked late into the night, our voices hushed, punctuated by the occasional creak of the house settling. Lucas spoke of his doubts, his fears, his longing for connection, and I listened, unable to look away. I felt a pull toward him that frightened me, a magnetic tension that made my chest ache. I knew that this closeness, this emotional intimacy, was dangerous. It was a form of betrayal, not physical but just as real. My mind screamed at me to stop, to maintain the boundaries we had always respected, yet my heart and my body betrayed that instinct, responding to his presence with an involuntary closeness. At one point, Lucas laughed softly at a memory from college, the sound warm and familiar. I found myself smiling too, but it wasn't just amusement, it was a recognition of a connection that neither of us fully admitted. Our hands brushed lightly when I handed him a blanket he had fetched, a fleeting contact that lingered in the air longer than either of us expected. There was no deliberate intention, no explicit act, but the emotional current between us deepened in ways I couldn't deny. It was a silent acknowledgement of feelings we had long buried, and in that acknowledgement, a new reality began to form. That I left that evening with a strange mix of relief and unease. Part of me cherished the closeness, the rare glimpse into Lucas's vulnerabilities, while another part recoiled at the moral compromise we had both made. It was emotional infidelity, subtle yet undeniable, a crossing of lines neither of us had intended but somehow allowed. The drive home was quiet, the streets blurred by my thoughts, each moment replaying fragments of our conversation. I could still hear his voice, soft and confiding, and I realized that what had happened wasn't a fleeting lapse, it was a shift that would have consequences. By the next morning, the house of comfort I had known in Lucas's presence felt different. Memories of the night lingered, lingering like shadows that followed me wherever I went. I felt the weight of unspoken guilt pressing on me, the realization that our friendship had been altered. Lucas had returned to his routine, perhaps unaware of the impact, while I wrestled with my own emotions, aware that my perception of him, and of myself, had changed irrevocably. The line between friendship and something more had blurred, leaving me in a liminal space between desire and remorse, and yet, despite the unease, there was no turning back. Something had shifted in the dynamic between us, subtle but undeniable. The ordinary visit, the simple invitation, had become a quiet turning point, the moment when emotional boundaries were breached, when trust and desire collided. And I knew, deep down, that our relationship would never be the same. What had begun as a friendly visit had set us on a path neither of us could fully anticipate, a path that would lead to choices, consequences, and truths we would soon have to confront. The days after the rain-soaked encounter, Ethan felt a restless tension that refused to fade. Every message, every call from Kofi carried an unspoken weight. Even a simple, "Hey, want to hang out," seemed to vibrate with meaning, reminding Ethan of the shift that had already taken place between them. The line between friendship and something more had blurred, leaving him exhilarated, anxious, and deeply conflicted. Kofi seemed aware of the effect he had on Ethan and, without overt declaration, continued to push boundaries. Small gestures, a hand brushing Ethan's shoulder, a lingering gaze, became more deliberate, more intimate. Each interaction left Ethan both wanting and wary, caught in a storm of desire and guilt. He loved the closeness, yet feared it, aware that crossing the unspoken line could upend everything they had shared. One evening, Kofi invited Ethan to his apartment under the pretext of watching a movie together. The dim lighting, the quiet hum of the city outside, and the soft music in the background created a private cocoon. Kofi sat close, an arm casually draped along the back of the sofa. Ethan felt the heat of proximity, the tension building between them like an invisible current. He wanted to pull away, to remind himself of boundaries, but he found himself frozen, captivated by Kofi's presence. Words were scarce, yet their silence was heavy with meaning. Kofi spoke finally, his voice low and sincere. "Ethan. I don't want to force anything. But I can't deny how I feel." Ethan's chest tightened. He understood the weight of the confession, not in the grand, dramatic way, but in a quiet, unavoidable reality that demanded attention. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, Ethan realized just how deeply he had been drawn in, how much he had allowed his emotions to take the lead. Guilt gnawed at him. He thought of his own principles, the trust he had with friends and family, and the societal expectations that weighed heavily on him. Yet, at the same time, he couldn't deny the thrill of connection, the sense of being truly seen and understood by Kofi. He wrestled internally, desire versus restraint, morality versus heart. The tension was suffocating, yet impossible to ignore. Kofi's presence was transformative. His confidence and openness forced Ethan to confront emotions he had long buried, feelings he had struggled to accept even within himself. Ethan realized that the ride, the lingering touches, the shared moments, they had revealed truths about his identity, his desires, and his capacity for intimacy. He began to understand that life was no longer a series of safe, predictable choices. It was complicated, messy, and profoundly human. By the time the night ended, Ethan felt changed. Not because he had acted on temptation, but because he had confronted it, acknowledged it, understood it, and recognized its impact on his life. He and Kofi remained close, yet the nature of their connection had shifted irrevocably. Trust and friendship remained, but layered now with awareness, with vulnerability, and with unspoken possibility. In the following weeks, Ethan reflected on the transformation. He understood that relationships, whether romantic, platonic, or somewhere in between, were not defined solely by action, but by honesty, courage, and self-awareness. Kofi had challenged him to confront his fears, to acknowledge his desires, and to embrace the complexity of emotion without shame. It was a lesson in self-acceptance and growth, one Ethan knew would stay with him long after the fleeting moments of tension had passed. The final scene mirrors the story's opening, but with subtle change. Ethan rides his bike alone along the same suburban streets, the wind still tugging at his hair, the hum of tires on asphalt familiar and comforting. Yet now, each moment carries reflection, the past day's emotional turbulence, the subtle shifts in his understanding of friendship and love, and the awareness that life's most meaningful connections often come with complexity. As the sun dips below the horizon, Ethan slows his bike at the park where he and Kofi had paused so many times. He leans against the railing, letting the breeze wash over him, and thinks quietly, that ride had changed everything, not in ways he could have predicted, but in ways that mattered. Some doors had opened, others had shifted, and his heart, once cautious and hesitant, had been awakened to a truth he could no longer ignore. Even after our conversation in the park, the echoes of that night lingered between Lucas and me. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the shape of our friendship had subtly changed. We no longer fell into effortless conversation, instead, we measured our words, aware of the fragility of trust. It was strange, Lucas was still my best friend in name, but the intimacy we had once shared carried the quiet weight of unspoken boundaries crossed. Every interaction reminded me that emotional connections, even without physical acts, have consequences that ripple outward in unexpected ways. I spent hours reflecting on my own role in what had happened. The guilt was persistent, a constant companion during long, solitary walks and quiet nights at home. I realized that emotional betrayal isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's the quiet moments of attention, the subtle lingering in conversation, or the unspoken recognition of feelings that shouldn't exist. I had crossed a line, even without meaning to, and that acknowledgement forced me to confront who I was, not just as a friend, but as a person capable of desire and mistake. The line between love and loyalty, it seemed, was thinner than I had ever imagined. Lucas, too, was not untouched by the experience. I noticed in his messages a cautious distance, a politeness tinged with something unspoken. He would occasionally reference the past, reminiscing about lighter moments from college or our shared jokes, but he never allowed our conversations to slip into the emotional territory that had caused so much tension. It was as if both of us were silently agreeing, the closeness that had once defined us could not be reclaimed, and the lesson we had learned could only exist in memory, not practice. I recognized, perhaps for the first time, how complex human connections are, how easily trust can fracture. Even in the absence of clear wrongdoing that I and the weeks that followed, I made a conscious effort to rebuild my sense of self apart from Lucas. I focused on my own routines, my work, and my hobbies, trying to create boundaries that would prevent my heart from wandering into dangerous territory again. And yet, there was a strange comfort in knowing that Lucas still cared, in his quiet, restrained way. Our friendship had shifted, yes, but it had not been destroyed entirely. We had both made mistakes, and we were both carrying the consequences, but there was a fragile understanding between us, a silent acknowledgement of lessons learned and regrets held in checkpoint. One evening, I found myself walking past Lucas's house, the street lights casting long shadows across the pavement. I paused, remembering the night that had changed everything, the laughter, the silences, the closeness that had been as intoxicating as it was forbidden. A part of me longed for the ease of those moments, but another part recognized that longing is dangerous. Desire, I realized, was a powerful force, but it had to be tempered by conscience. Emotional intimacy, like a spark, could ignite beauty or destruction depending on how it was handled. And in our case, that spark had been a quiet warning of both. That I decided, finally, to write down my reflections. Not as an accusation, nor as a confession, but as a way to make sense of the whirlwind of feelings and the consequences that had followed. I wrote about Lucas's warmth, his confessions, and the quiet pull that had drawn me in. I wrote about my own guilt, my regret, and my awareness of the moral responsibility we both bore. And as I wrote, I felt a weight lifting, not the guilt entirely, but the sense of clarity that comes from understanding one's own role in a story, from confronting the choices that have shaped the present. By the time I set the pen down, I knew that the relationship between Lucas and me would never return to what it once was. But I also knew that we had survived the test of trust, if only barely, and that we had emerged with a deeper awareness of ourselves and each other. Emotional mistakes, I realized, are rarely dramatic, they linger quietly, like shadows, shaping how we move through the world. And while that night had irrevocably altered our friendship, it had also offered a lesson, that integrity matters, that boundaries exist for a reason, and that the choices we make, however subtle, have the power to change everything. That I looked forward, not back, carrying the lessons of that evening like a compass. Lucas would remain an important part of my life, but with respect, boundaries, and a tempered understanding. The ordinary invitation that had once seemed so insignificant had become the catalyst for growth, for reflection, and for a deeper understanding of love and loyalty. And in that quiet knowledge, I found a sense of peace, knowing that though nothing would ever be the same, I had learned how to navigate the complex terrain of the heart.